Okay. So, continuing on psychology and pornography. And in both ironic and unironic way, this particular series of conversations, I wish you were here so we could talk together, is why porn is awesome. And I'm having, as you remember, I'm having this particular, or offering this particular discourse because of some of my concerns. Oppression does not liberate, it condemns, like we talk about in some of my other classes. The more we oppress something, it's not setting our behavior free necessarily. Instead, it is condemning that particular behavior, and with that condemnation comes hopelessness, comes shame. When we can appreciate something for what it is very complexly, then that gives us opportunities to appreciate, intervene, support, etc., sometimes all at the same time. So, in case some of you were not here during the first day of class, I'd like to review the 4 dimensions of thinking and apply those to the question of what is pornography. Okay? So the first dimension of thought, if you remember, is what I call unary thinking, and it is categorical thinking. It is knowing what a thing is and seeking to know what a thing is by defining it and operationalizing it in certain ways. It is looking at a thing in and of itself to discover what that thing is. So if I am thinking this particular way about human beings, then I'm going to seek to put human beings into categorical boxes. What are the defining characteristics of human? Is this being human? And if so, do they meet sufficient criteria of human? And if I'm looking at this particular chemical versus that particular, or these other chemicals, right? That first dimensional thinking is seeking after the thing itself and defining it in and of itself, okay? So when we take up first dimensional thinking and we apply it to pornography, it begs a question, and that is, what is porn? And I'm chuckling because there have been various commissions and efforts to define it, and none have succeeded. So first dimensional thinking doesn't seem necessarily to apply. Oh, but you're fine, go ahead and get your stuff.
Okay.
And so the Warren Commission back in the 90s, where this congressional Senate leader just basically concluded, we can't define porn, but I know it when I see it. And so I kind of chuckle at that, because first dimensional thinking they were failing their first dimensional thought on this. They couldn't even define it for what it is. And so I am going to offer a definition that is necessarily incomplete and would not have passed by this particular commission, I humbly admit. And that is, pornography is anything that is designed to titillate or arouse, or has the effect of titillating or arousing sexually. So my definition is very controversial and would not hold water probably on the sake of this particular class, because that means that there are things that are titillating and arousing that were never intended to be such, but somebody is taking it pornographically. And we'll get into fourth dimensional thinking here in a minute. So second dimensional thinking is when we start thinking in black and white and oppositional terms, right? This is binary thinking, it's second dimensional thinking. And a consequence of second dimensional thinking is anytime we define something, we are also defining its opposite. So when it comes to human beings, that we find this binary thinking a lot, especially in the world of sex and gender, where there is male and female, and they're taken up, I know, surprising enough, as opposite. Not as categories unto themselves. Like I can think first dimensionally about men and have certain defining characteristics of men. And I can think first dimensionally about women and have certain defining characteristics of women that have nothing to do with each other. That's first dimensional thinking about gender, which does not exclude the possibility of other genders. That I would take those genders up and I would look at those in very categorical ways. Okay, you have the category of this gender, you have the category of that gender, this other gender. That's first dimensional thinking on gender. Second dimensional thinking is when we put them in opposition to one another. That men and women are opposites. So therefore, if I change any definition about man, I am simultaneously changing definition of woman. Okay? So that's very interesting. Matt, what do you mean? If women wear dresses, do men? If a man wears a dress, is he more womanly? And so some of you are like, well, of course not. Right, but to a second dimensional thinker, they're like, no, men don't wear dresses. Or if men have short hair, women have long hair, right? That's this oppositional term. If men are strong in some ways, women are weak in those same ways. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. They're totally different, right? That's second dimensional kinds of thinking. And so if I give resources to one gendered group, let's say in STEM, for example, there are scholarships available at our university for women in STEM, and many of these scholarships go unfulfilled. And I've actually heard colleagues of mine with PhDs engage in second dimensional thinking, going, oh, look all this money we're stealing from the boys to have these scholarships for girls that the girls aren't taking. It's not a zero-sum game, right? Sorry, I'm criticizing second dimensional thinking as I'm saying it, that they think in this particular way, that everything is in opposition, and they're oppositional relationships, and that by giving to one, I'm taking from another. By defining one, I'm simultaneously defining the other. So if women are in the workplace now, I have weakened men, like is a second dimensional argument. Likewise, gay and straight, that there are those who think, not everybody on this particular issue thinks in second dimensional binary terms, but many do within and without the gay community. And that is that if a homosexual has certain defining characteristics, and therefore heterosexuals have opposite characteristics. If a heterosexual has a deep voice and is hairy and is smells bad and has bad taste in clothes, well then a gay man must be have a higher registered pitched voice, have great taste in clothes, and have impeccable personal hygiene. That they think in these kind of binary terms. Of course, again, to throw in another criticism, reality often surprises binary thinkers and sometimes frustrates them, or often frustrates them. So when it comes to pornography, the question becomes, porn is good or bad, is one way of taking this up second dimensionally. Apologies, one of my dogs is a chonk. He is very large, he's barrel-chested, and he quits forgetting that he's a puppy, and he can't take the corner on our laminated stairs, which are very slippery for him, and so he slams his poor hips in the corner as he runs down the stairway. It's funny and sad at the same time. So second dimensional thinking when it comes to porn is porn good or bad, right? That there's this black and white thinking that people on various sides of this issue, we've got the porn is good people and we've got the porn is bad people. And so there's, again, that kind of binary thinking. It's either one or the other. And if it's good in some ways, then it's bad in opposite ways. Or, if it is bad, then its opposite is absolute non-porn stuff. And if, non-porn is good, then porn is bad. And any defining of sexuality non-pornographized then changes the definition of what porn is. So, yeah. I was going to go on a long tangent about the pornographization of certain things and certain processes, but I'll contain my short attention span and try to stay on topic. So, second dimensional thinking on porn is it's either good or bad, or there's porn and non-porn. There's healthy sex versus pornography. That there are these second dimensional thinking about it, right? This oppositional thinking. And then third dimensional thinking is relativistic thinking. This is the observation that everything is relative. So back to my earlier statement, there are some things I have found that some people can take up pornographically that were never intended as such. And that can be quite surprising. And there are other things that some people have created to be titillating that doesn't titillate many people at all. So a couple of examples. There was a client of mine who was from another country and was raised in a different culture with different standards of modesty and what bits of the body should be covered up and when and how. And he found, especially he loved summertime here in the United States because as the people in the sexes that he preferred were wearing less clothing, it was very arousing for him. So they were not intending to arouse him, quite the contrary, but he would find himself sitting in a commons area at the university just staring at people, and it was getting him in trouble. And so, not legal trouble or anything, but to the point where it was having a disruptive effect. He was aware of the disruptive effect and came for counsel. So, again, that 99% or more of the people in that particular commons area at the university were not feeling aroused, just seeing one another in shorts and tank tops, etc. But for him, it was very arousing. And so, likewise, when it comes to things that are created to be pornographic, and many people don't take it up as such, I was, through one of my kids, introduced to the world of furry porn. So furry porn is the sexualization of humanoid animals. So you take a dog and you draw that particular dog is in a humanoid shape with exaggerated sexual features, breasts, genitals, etc. And that there is a group of people who find that very arousing, so much so that I've actually met an artist, and although it pains her to admit, she makes a fair bit of money accepting custom commissions drawing furry porn for people. So this particular humanoid horse having sex with this particular humanoid cat, or things like that. And so, although that doesn't arouse or titillate everybody, it can arouse and titillate a group of people to the point where they will pay extra money for it. And so, likewise, when we zoom across time, place, and culture, that what is pornographic seems to change, and pornography as a process or as a thing is, you find, is surprisingly very old. Some people think it's a very recent invention, but it's not. It goes back a long time. So fourth dimensional thinking is thinking about all of the simultaneities, thinking about the context of pornography. It is thinking about what goes on with the body viewing pornography, the way in which that can be helpful and unhelpful at the same time, the way in which certain cultures take up porn in certain ways, and what's going on in those cultures that pornography takes on those particular meanings in those particular ways at that particular time. So in the United States, for example, we create and produce a lot of porn. In fact, it's quite remarkable how much pornography we produce as a society. And there are some lovely documentaries that if we had time in class, I would fire up Netflix and watch, After Porn Ends and some of those kinds of documentaries about the culture of pornography production in this particular country. And so there is the observation that pornography has effects that must be compelling effects, or it must involve compelling enough processes or outcomes that so much time and energy and money is invested in it, and so much time, energy, and money is spent on it. So therefore, what are those things? And that's part of the purpose of this unit today, is when we look at things in whole relationship complexly, it helps us change the picture of what's going on outside of simple binary thinking. Or relativistic thinking. Like, imagine you're a sex therapist, and you are working with a woman in her 40s. I knew a client I had some years ago who was spending a lot of her time masturbating and reading pornography. Now, she at first very strongly objected to the categorization of her media as porn. She didn't experience it as such, she said. Even though she would get very aroused while she read it and would masturbate, she had a denial, a very strong psychological denial, that it was pornography that she was partaking in. So her particular form of pornography were what I call, perhaps pejoratively, is bodice ripper romance novels. So those romance novels with the lurid cover where the woman has recently suffered an assault, like a woman in a Victorian dress, and her long-haired, oil-chested, muscular hero, and she is swooning and passing out, and her breasts are almost falling out of her rent attire, and he rescues her, and they have mad, passionate sex, and iterations on that. It's like I tease my students locally that there is a bookstore chain locally called Deseret Book that largely seems to propagate and sell religious materials to a particular denomination. The number one selling books, though, when you look at their reports on what sells, are romance novels. Now, I don't know that I don't think they're luridly sexually explicit, but they are very emotionally evocative. And so I just chuckled that, in this religious bookstore, it's a Christianized version of the same romance novel where it's PG-13 rather than R-rated and things like that, the way we buy into certain messages that allow us to assuage our conscience with our behavior, and I love that that's something we all do. So she's reading these bodice rippers and masturbating and is in denial that that's what's going on, but has affected her sex life to the point where her husband asked her to get counseling. And so the message she starts receiving is, what you're doing is bad, awful, and terrible. That's oppression, and again, oppression doesn't liberate, it condemns. And so how do we understand this behavior and what's going on here in a way that ceases the oppression and ceases the condemnation, and still then, or hopefully then, offers other avenues to get whatever needs met that she has for this particular medium, and open up options for other things, like hopefully a better relationship with her husband. So likewise, this has been some years ago. I picked up a friend who was a photographer. He was the one filming the video on a small porn set, and I didn't know that that's what he was shooting. And me and a couple other friends showed up to pick him up. And as we go in the particular room, so it was part of a larger building, and there was a little area that was kind of a bifold wall, a little mock bedroom with a bed and other accoutrements. And the cameras were here and here, and he would move between cameras and film these particular sexual activities. And it was interesting watching the reactions of my two friends, and that is, as they came in, their noses curled up. And they're like, oh my gosh, oh boy, what? And I said, what's going on here? And they said, it smells like old semen and rancid lube. And I don't have a sense of smell, so I'm sorry I can't describe it very well to you, but apparently there was a particular smell associated with that particular set that had been used multiples of times, and the scent was not pleasant. And our friend the photographer assures us that you get used to it, and after a while you don't even notice it. Well, that got me spinning on some questions. So that seems unpleasant for some people, this particular scenting of when you have two people who are having a simulacrum of some sexual behavior, and they're doing it in this particular way for a period of time. There's lube involved because I learned at that time that some of the actors and actresses didn't find what they were doing to be actually very sexy. So the men would use certain sexual performance enhancing things, Viagra for example, and then the women would need lubrication, because in order to demonstrate the exaggerated motions within the porn, that there would need to be the kinds of activities that normal vaginal lubrication wouldn't be up to, as well as the woman wasn't necessarily aroused. She's acting like she's aroused, that's why they're called actors in porn, right? She's acting like she's aroused, but at the same time she wasn't actually physiologically sexually aroused to the point where sex could be comfortable, so you have to use a lot of lube. And I didn't know that lube has a smell with it, that apparently that there's a smell when it's fresh and a different smell when it's a little old, and some people don't find the old lube smell very compelling. So therefore I get to wonder if some of these things are unpleasant, like if, to use a phrase from that informal happenstance meeting that was years ago, is jackhammer sex, that there are these exaggerated motions on the part of one of the partners to really show a certain effect, and that is not necessarily how human genitals were designed to function. And so that can be very painful and unpleasant. There was, this is later I noticed in some of the documentaries and research on the same topic, that a male actor sometimes with chemical help can go from shoot to shoot to shoot, whereas the female actors, and presuming it's heterosexual porn, and sometimes need a break for some days to heal, because their insides feel, the vagina feels bruised, or other parts of their body feel bruised, and it takes some time to recover. And so, fourth dimensionally, I'm like, wow, that seems very unpleasant. There must be reasons why, some goods that these people are endeavoring that would keep them endeavoring this. Like, what is going on such that people would do this? And so I found out about one of the things that's motivating for many of us is money, that it can be a way to make some money. And that seems very important in some ways, especially when some people have found that other means of income have been cut off from them, that having access to finances can be very important. And so I get that. For some people that there is a desire to perform, a desire to be the center of attention, and sometimes that can be a very important desire, to feel like an object of desire, to feel like you are desirable, and that can be important, I think, for many people. Now, at the same time though, again, thinking fourth dimensionally, that sometimes, not always, but sometimes it can be I'm thinking about a couple people I know who are sex workers or in the porn industry, whose participation in that particular activity is a recapitulation of earlier sexual traumas, that they were mistaught at a young age that what they are best for is their appearance or their bodies or their sex, their sexuality. And so therefore, as they were maturing, they didn't necessarily see other options for them to do other sorts of behaviors. And so therefore their careers were kind of foreclosed in a sex work kind of direction because of the way they were sexualized at a very young age. And that seems like it can be a pretty big problem. So when we look at those who are viewing pornography, we also can take this up fourth dimensionally. What is going on and what are they after? Why do this particular thing? Why do you suppose that a woman in her 40s is masturbating to the point where she's suffering from masturbation insensitivity syndrome as she reads these particular romance novels? That seems interesting. What goods is she accomplishing? And so one is escapism. Sometimes escaping the humdrum, dreary, or difficult lives we all lead can seem very important and very worthwhile. We have movies and video games, Netflix, all of these ways in which we can entertain ourselves, and so that's one way to do it. The other is that we live in in some ways, a pretty hedonistic society, that we tend to take happiness as a good, and many Americans I've noticed tend to define happiness, the good of happiness, as a pretty pleasurable happiness, like smiling, laughing, feelings of positive feelings of satisfactions of desires, like eating and sleeping and having sex. And happiness are these kinds of very bodily kinds of feelings. It's not most Americans that I talk to, and as a professor and as a therapist, I get to talk to a lot of people. They don't seem to define happiness in a transcendent way, but in a very hedonistic way, that there is that seeking after these kinds of pleasures. And so therefore, in our culture, that seems to be very important and is taken up culturally as a very valid endeavor. So therefore, if this is pleasing her, right, if it's making her happy to read these romance novels and masturbate, then that is good in some very important ways, that she is pleasing and is satisfying herself. At the same time, though, you can wonder, well, if it's good, then why did she end up in counseling? Because there are also some unfortunate things that happen with that. And that is that one of the consistent effects of regular pornography use is a decrease in satisfaction with flesh and blood others. So this is a very important consistent effect. And I want to rap about it for a minute. So one of the reasons why this woman finds herself in counsel, coming to me for therapy, is because when she had opportunities to have sex with her husband, or when her husband attempted to be flirtatious or seductive towards her, she was not interested in him at all. Their sex life had dropped to near zero. Now, a decrease in the frequency of sex isn't altogether uncommon when you look over the lifetime of a marriage. At the same time, though, what sex they did have was increasingly dissatisfactory. It always had been dissatisfactory to both of them, and was increasingly more so. And again, she's suffering from masturbation and sensitivity syndrome, so there was nothing he could do in the bedroom that was as powerful as her vibrator was. So they're kind of stuck in a problem where her pornography use is now informing their sex life negatively. And because he prefers not to masturbate, he would rather have sex with her, and because now that sex is unavailable, he's now put in a difficult position. So the other thing that was going on psychologically, and part of her disinterest in him, is he cannot compare to the men that she reads about in these romance novels. That the men in these romance novels are somehow super like edgy, badass, and yet very gentle and sensitive at the same time, or that she takes this, the violently homicidal pirate captain, and because of his love for her gives up his pirating ways, but is still a badass pirate in some ways, so therefore he's still hot and sexy, and he looks a certain way, he's got a certain build, and her portly, middle-aged, balding husband, who works as a computer engineer, doesn't meet any of those criteria. She finds him sexually disinteresting. She insists that she loves him, and when we investigated that, it was platonic love, meaning that she loved him in a friendly way. As per our class, it was like philia and stergo, etc. Those feelings, those loving emotions we defined earlier in the course, that those were going on for her, but not eros, not the sexy or the passionate love. And so we find that true across various genders, that those who use pornography frequently lose interest in their flesh and blood spouses. And so that is a demonstrable problem. So therefore, she is gaining some goods in terms of her pornography use, and for her it was coupled with masturbation. But with that also comes some simultaneous problems, right? A decrease of the satisfaction of her marriage and a decrease in the satisfaction of her sex life. So how could we help her, if we're sex therapists, how do we help her maintain the goods as well as not create detriment to her marriage? And that begs certain questions that are beyond our topic today. Why was their sex life so unfulfilling and dysfunctional to begin with? And it turns out there were reasons for that. And those reasons then led to or informed a lot of the other dynamics later. So therefore, it turned out to be a lot of depth psychotherapy, of getting into some pretty primitive beliefs. So I want to make sure I have time to tell the next story. I have plenty of time. I think I have plenty of time. And so we told this story in class the other day, and it's one of my favorite stories, but I want to reiterate it here. One of the things we can look at when we're taking up people's pornography use from a fourth dimensional mindset is what all is going on in that, with them individually, within their families, within the culture, within society, within those producing and acting in the pornography, because all of that informs one another in very contextual ways. So if we change any one part of this, we change the whole. Again, either thickly or thinly, to a small degree or to a large degree. So quick story, if you remember early in the semester, we talked about two different young men, both of whom wanted to go on an evangelical proselyting mission for their church. They were both members of the same church. And that particular church has particular standards about sexual behavior, that they demand celibacy before marriage and then monogamy during marriage. And celibacy for them excludes masturbation. So young people in that church are forbidden from even masturbating. And so these two young men are coming to me for counsel, and I found their stories very compelling, because one of them masturbated infrequently, and there were actually other issues that he wanted to work on before he went on his proselyting mission. And then for another, he was masturbating constantly, and to the point where he could get very little else done. He was masturbating about 4 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there were calluses on that poor boy's body where the body wasn't designed to have calluses necessarily. So he was suffering pretty badly. So here's the background of those two boys. And I'll let you guess, we'll pause for a second, I'll let you guess which one was coming to me more for anxiety and depression kinds of things, and really struggling existentially with the commitment of the religion. And then the other one was coming to me almost strictly for shame, sex, porn stuff. So, story one. Young man is living in Utah at the time, Salt Lake City. He reports one day he was just a little kid, he was about 7 years of age, and he goes out to play with his friends, and a box had fallen off the back of a truck, and it had lots of magazines in it. It looked like somebody was moving, so it had coffee table kinds of magazines. And some of those were old school Playboy magazines. And so as he's looking through, Field and Stream and Sports Illustrated, he also finds some of these Playboy magazines. And they feature topless or fully nude women in various poses. And he finds that he is getting a particular physiological reaction, and it feels kind of exciting and good, and he doesn't know what it means or why he's getting this particular reaction as a little boy when seeing these particular nude images of women. And so he wants to go and ask the arbiter of all knowledge to little boys what's going on and how that works. Well, the arbiter and the knower of all things to children is often the parent figure, and mother happened to be home. So he comes into mom, and he reports that he walked in and he was holding the centerfold. So a centerfold is like in the very middle of a magazine, it would fold out this way, so it was like 4 pages long, but it was one complete image, like a poster. And so he was holding it out like this, and the staples were straining, and he goes, "Mom, look at how pretty this," and that's as far as he got, as he's trying to tell mom how pretty this girl is. Mom freaks. He said they were in the kitchen at the time. Mom snatches the magazine out of his hand so violently it actually tears the centerfold. The magazine lands on the floor because mom can't get a grip on it, and mom's panicking and starting to hyperventilate. "What did you do? What are you bringing in, Mom? Ah!" And so she screams at the boy, "Go to your room. Your father will deal with you later." So he panics and he runs downstairs, and he hears mom run to her room and slam her door. And it was 10 a.m. in the morning, so he's grounded in his room until 6 p.m. when dad gets home, and mom grounded herself in her room, not being able to cope with the shame of seeing her son, and so both of them were locked away until 6 p.m. And then when dad came home, he heard mom yelling upstairs. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but dad came downstairs and was very angry and told them that he had brought Satan into their home, that how dare he do this kind of thing, that their home was a temple and he has now polluted the temple, etc. And so then father called everybody around, and he was, he had like 6 siblings or something, and so they all gathered around the wood-burning stove. Now, keep in mind, this is Utah in July. It's like 110 degrees outside. Dad stokes the wood-burning stove and then starts to tear the magazine and put it in the fire. And he's tearing out page by page and lecturing at the family, particularly this little boy, about this is what Heavenly Father does to people who engage in this kind of filth, that he throws them in the fire, burns them in hell for eternity, or whatever language do you insert here. Now some of you are saying, well, Matt, this is why I'm thoroughly anti or non-religious. Hold on, that's not the message that I'm sharing here. The message that I'm sharing here is that now we have a young boy who has deeply cathected shame. And if you remember from our earlier lectures, cathexis is when we have one thing, like libido, like a little boy's very primitive, very basic libido is now cathected with shame. So you get to wonder, and we'll talk about this here in a minute, about the effect that might have on him psychologically growing up. So the second little boy was 8 years of age, and so again, later he's about 19, he's coming to me for some therapy before he goes on his mission. And he's the youngest of 5 brothers, and he and his brothers are mountain biking in the desert somewhere outside of Las Vegas, somewhere in Nevada. And as they're biking along, the older brothers are teasing dad because dad's a little winded and he's struggling, he's not as athletic as he used to be. And so dad gets his testosterone on, manifests old man strength, and just, "Oh yeah, I'll show you boys," and just jets ahead, just stands up on his bike and powers ahead of his sons. And during all of this, my future client, this little boy, is starting to whine because he needs to stop and pee. His mom and dad kept insisting, you need to drink, you need to stay hydrated. And so he needed to pee because he was pretty hydrated. And so they stop by a copse of like rubble and brush and everything else, and as they stop and he goes into the bushes to pee, what he finds is that somebody had dumped like a ton of their porn collection just out there in the middle of the desert on the other side of the scrub. And so the very top layer was just sun bleached, and the sun does violent things to print. And so, but it was enough where you could tell what that was a giant pile of. And so he forgets all about his bursting bladder and just starts picking through the pile and just sees magazine and VHS tapes, etc., all very sexually explicit, all very graphic pornography. Well, his older brothers get a little frustrated, and a couple of his brothers are in their teenage years, and so they come to get him, and as he hears them walking through the brush, he tries to lay on top of this huge mountain of porn, of withering porn in the desert. Nothing to see here, nothing's going on, nothing's happening, I'll be right there. And so his brothers kept see this huge mountain of porn, throw their little brother aside, my future client, and they start pulling through the pile. It's like a gold mine for teenage and older children libidos. And so they're looking through this, and oh my gosh, and they start laughing and joking. They don't have the language yet to talk about what they're seeing or what it means. And so as they're going through this, they're of course laughing and, oh my gosh, look at these boobies, and this one has pubes, and this one doesn't. They're just, being silly boys about it. And because they're making so much noise, having that kind of the excitement of doing something naughty, something that they know according to the teachings of their culture, they shouldn't be doing, but they're really enjoying doing it. And so they don't hear Dad come. So Dad comes walking up, because he gets a ways ahead, looks over his shoulder to see where his boys are, and doesn't see them. Dad panics and comes back down the road. And so, the dirt road, and so they don't hear Dad coming. So Dad comes up and sees what his boys are doing, and he goes, hey boys, what's this? And the boys panic, and like Technicolor Dreamcoat, their little brother, oh, it's him, he's the problem, he's the one, oh my gosh, it's all, And so Dad goes over and he sits down amongst his sons, and they're all like freaking out. And Dad reaches inside this giant pile, pulls out a magazine at random, and holds out one of the images of one of these women in sexually provocative positions. And my client later reports that he doesn't remember the exact words, but Dad said something along the lines of, look how beautiful this young lady is. It is a blessing from our Heavenly Father that we live in a world with other people, and how people can be beautiful. And so she is beautiful in a particular way where people will pay her money to take her picture. And she's very blessed that she gets to be that pretty. Now, one of the things that we also see is with these kind of images that we get to feel what is called a libido. And God gave us this. And later on, as you boys get older, and for your older teenage boys, you're already feeling it, this is our desire to hug and kiss and have sex with our wives. That part of Heavenly Father, part of this godly design is for us to really have these feelings with our spouse. And that one of the reasons why we're careful about porn in our religion is because some people see this pornography and they begin to prefer pornography over their flesh and blood spouses, or they use pornography to distract themselves from their flesh and blood spouses. And he said, instead, guys, rather than us like hanging out with all this porn stuff, why don't we actually save our libidos for the actual pretty women in our lives, our wives, our future wives. And let's do that responsibly in a way that's very good for them. So our libidos are beautiful, these girls are beautiful, our wives your future wives are going to be beautiful, so let's just leave this behind, right? We don't need this. And so Dad gets up and they start biking away. And so it becomes an academic question with an obvious answer, or seemingly obvious answer. Which one of these two is crippled with porn? The one that was punished for seeing pornography and bringing it into the home, or the one who was supported in having a libido and was taught lessons about the nature of libido vis-a-vis that particular religious culture? And of course, you're not surprised with the answer. The young man who is the little boy who was heavily punished for porn began actively seeking it out, that it was so heavily oppressed and he felt so ashamed of himself that he started using pornography very compulsively. Whereas the other young man only used pornography occasionally, like once a week when he would masturbate, but his real concerns were existential concerns about his commitment to his religion and whether or not, given that he had doubts about his religion, whether or not he could convert other people to it. So, no, I won't tell you the ending of either story. regardless, endings are never endings, they're only stories up to a point. So those kinds of things were happening. Back to this woman who was coming to me for counsel. She's masturbating, she's reading her romance novels, she has virtually no sex life with her flesh and blood husband. That there were a lot of those same kind of sexually shaming messages going on in her life. That she also discovered her libido at a very young age. She was like 10 when she started to have feelings for boys that no one would talk to her about. She didn't know how to articulate them. She just wanted to be around boys, and she wanted to touch boys and be touched by boys, not in a sexually mature way, but like hugging and holding hands and those kinds of things. But anytime she would endeavor to do so, that was interpreted by adults as though she was exercising her libido in a very adult way, and therefore her libido was strongly oppressed by the adults who were meaning to help and protect her, when what it actually did was oppress and shame her. So therefore, it kind of had the opposite effect in the long run. So let's talk a little bit. I don't know that we have time to get into this in detail, but I'd at least like to touch on it before we get into our next unit. And that is some of the things that seem to maybe go on with us neurologically. How it is that we have this particular pleasure response. So, in a neuroimaging study back in 2016, these particular researchers used a functional MRI machine to scan the brains of male pornography viewers, and they showed that there was enhanced activity in what's called the ventral striatum in the brain. Now, this is part of the brain that is correlated with decision-making behavior that involves reward. So it's less active if I am choosing between red and green markers for my whiteboard. It is more active if I am choosing ice cream or not, then it really activates, or if I'm choosing between flavors of ice cream, and I happen to like ice cream, right? So there's a reward going on there. And so they're arguing that, hey, the same reward center is also active during other kinds of dopamine-seeking things, like when people seek after drugs, like illicit drug use, and that's where some of the porn is a drug, etc., comes from. And what worries me is that's not actually what these studies say. I mean, some extrapolate on it and guess about it in their discussion section. Most don't. What they're really talking about is look at this particular brain section that is involved in reward activities, which includes eating, sleeping, talking to a friend, as well as things like pornography viewing or having sex with a lover or taking heroin. It's involved in all of these processes. And so another study. So therefore, this is part of the reason why pornography works, is it is a simulacrum of sex without being sex. In fact, I kind of chuckle because when you look at what good sex is and you look at what good porn is, they're related and different. Related in the sense that there's often, genital touching and thrusting and those kinds of activities. But at the same time, it also looks very different. Good sex, when we poll people over a long period of time who have good sex life, good sex seems to involve what is called intimacy. Now, I'm worried about using that word because intimacy, I've noticed in subcultural groups here in this country that intimacy is a word for sex, but sex isn't intimacy. They're different things. In fact, I've seen a lot of rather non-intimate sex going on in our world, particularly pornography, where there's not emotional touching or sharing or things like that. Instead, it's just right to the act of sex, and right to the act of sex very directly and sometimes violently. That's not intimacy. Intimacy is emotional togetherness, it's emotional sharing. Gottman is a famous marriage counselor, and he has said repeatedly through the years of his career, is that good sex starts with good kissing. I would add to that, I don't know that Gottman's necessarily wrong, I think he seems to be onto something in many ways, is that good sex also begins with good intimacy, and good intimacy is healthy, loving communication, right? To be vulnerable and real with each other. So, therefore, we get to wonder about, can pornography facilitate intimacy? And what would that pornography look like? And can pornography inhibit intimacy? And what would that pornography look like? And likewise, how could the same pornography be used to both deaden intimacy unintentionally or heighten intimacy intentionally or unintentionally. Oh, I've got so many stories I don't have time to share. But I'm thinking porn would look different if it depicted actual sex. And in fact, I wonder how many people would view it if porn was actually just two loving people making out, enjoying one another, kind of talking and having sex all at the same time, the way healthy lovers do. I don't know that many people would watch that. It would probably feel intrusive. I don't know, some people might get off on it. So there is a concern, and I think this is a very justified concern, that there was again, another study in 2016, apparently a lot of porn studies happened in 2016, or published in 2016, where there were 38 male subjects, average 25 years of age, so prime libido years. They found that in that particular study, very limited sample, right, take this with a grain of salt, but still take it and think about it, that 60% of these participants reported having difficulty achieving erections or feeling aroused to the point of ejaculation during intercourse with real-life partners, but did not have a problem getting erections while watching porn. That again, this is a particular group of people who had this particular struggle in a particular way. But it shows how it is that they had exercised their porn use to the point where having those particular feelings of arousal were more increasingly dialed in for them than having sex with their flesh and blood other. And so that can be a concern, and we see that from time to time. So Journal of Sexual Medicine, 2016, they actually took pornography use and broke pornography users into 3 categories. The recreational, at-risk, and compulsive, and that was based on the amount of time spent viewing pornography in a week. And they discovered that recreational users reported higher sexual satisfaction and lower sexual compulsivity, avoidance, and dysfunction. And the middle group, there wasn't a really statistical significant relationship either way. It seemed to be an admixture of the other 2 groups. While compulsive users experienced lower sexual satisfaction, higher sexual compulsivity, and higher avoidance of actual opportunities to have sex with flesh and blood others. That leads us to another observation. We also find that sexes differ in terms of the physiological effect of pornography use. That although I had a client, as you know, this woman I have mentioned, who was compulsively using pornography and masturbating, oftentimes we find that women who recreationally use pornography are actually more likely to seek out sexual contact with their flesh and blood lovers, whereas men who use it recreationally do similarly. Where our problem is that men have a lower threshold for compulsion than women do, pretending we live in a world with only 2 sexes, but that still accounts for 96% of people, so I'm just going to use this as an example for now, that it's a threshold problem. So most of the time, women who read romance novels are actually more likely to want to have sex with their flesh and blood lover, their flesh and blood spouse or partner, while at the same time their satisfaction for that particular partner's appearance or look or sexual style does decrease a little bit. They're still more likely to seek it out. Whereas men, again with that lower threshold, if they stay in the recreational use category, are still more likely to seek out their flesh and blood lover, but it still decreases slightly their satisfaction with their lover's appearance, style, etc. And so it's interesting that these thresholds differ, where women can spend a lot more time, say, watching pornography, reading romance novels, etc., and not have the detriment that men do given the same period of time in terms of the effect on the actual flesh and blood relationship or relationships. So that's pretty interesting, and I don't understand the biology or physiology behind it very well, but psychologically speaking, men seem to be more intensely attuned to visual phenomena, whereas women are more intensely attuned, again, variances exist, but on average to more relational phenomena. So therefore, when we look at the pornography participation habits between men and women, they overlap, and the means are a little different. So it's not huge night and day difference, but Pornhub, for example, has a category called For Women, and it is very interesting to us researchers, noting the difference in how that pornography is produced and what the actors do compared to all the rest of pornography, which is considered for men. So, yeah, those are some interesting differences. Oh, that's sharp. So, our next unit is also going to be on something fun. And I'm going to try to get myself out of this little camp chair. Because remember, my son's rolly chair is too narrow for my childbearing hips.